Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you that have dialed in, my name is Brian Stevens, and it is my distinct privilege to serve this region as the president and CEO of the Hampton Roads Chamber. We're honored to collaborate with Dean Tanner and the Strome College of Business for this very unique series. We've been doing this for what, Jeff, a couple of years now. And
yeah,
at least a couple of years, and I think it's been very beneficial. Obviously, the intent is to inform our members and the college students at Old Dominion University on subjects that we feel are important to them. We're also very pleased to have Atlantic Union Bank as the Chamber Strome Business Series presenting sponsor. I want to personally thank Andrew Hodge from Atlantic Union. He joins us now and will make a few comments. So Andy, I'll turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon. Welcome to another Chamber Strome Business Series event. Thank you, Dean Tanner and Brian, for allowing us to be involved in this effort. Atlantic Union Bank is a proud sponsor of the Hampton Roads Chamber of Commerce, as well as the Strome School of Business at Old Dominion University. As the largest regional bank headquartered in the Commonwealth, as well as the only bank that has coverage across the entire state, we believe in supporting the business community. Now more than ever, we understand the importance of bringing people together in a safe but engaging format. I hope you all are as excited about today's speaking event than I am. With 2 weeks left in the election, I think that Mr. Bergsten brings a wealth of experience and knowledge that should make for an engaging and worthwhile discussion today. Once again, I look forward to seeing you all in person at some point in time. I appreciate everyone being here today, and on behalf of Atlantic Union Bank, thank you and enjoy today's speaker.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And at this time, please welcome Dean Jeff Tanner, who will share a few words about ODU Business School and introduce our speaker. So over to you, Jeff.
thank you, Brian. And we're really proud of our collaboration with the Chamber, particularly with the Chamber Strome series today. We have a number of students from the Strome College of Business here because our mantra is engage, accelerate, succeed. And engagement in events of this nature accelerates our students' success, but it can accelerate your firm's success as well. So if you want to support economic development in brain drain, then send your children to ODU, sharpen our students by collaborating with us on problem solving in your organization, and then hire them as interns and employees. With a top 25 MBA program and undergraduate programs tailored for this region, such as supply chain with maritime options, professional sales, and human capital management, we're ready to help you grow your business so that you can hire more of our students. Today's speaker is Fred Bergsten, and I'm really happy to welcome Fred back to the Hampton Roads area and to the Strome College of Business. He's an economist, author, and political advisor. Previously, he served as an assistant for international economic affairs to Henry Kissinger within the National Security Council and as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Treasury. He directed the Peterson Institute for International Economics, formerly the Institute for International Economics, from its founding in 1981 through 2012, and is now Senior Fellow and Director Emeritus. And in addition to his academic work, he makes his opinions known to the policymaking community. He also engages with the public with television appearances, writing for influential periodicals, and numerous books. Ladies and gentlemen, Fred Bergsten.
Jeff, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you and the folks in the chamber. I wish I could be there in person, and we originally planned it that way, but I hope that can occur in the near future on another occasion. In the meanwhile, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the discussion. What I'm going to do is start with 4 takeaways, which I hope you will glean from my remarks, then spend a little more time on the background of where the economy stands and what the election may mean for it, and then finally be happy to answer questions that any of the folks in the audience may have that you may channel to me. So let me start with the 4 takeaways. First, The economy is about halfway back from the enormous decline triggered by the pandemic early this year. Now, that's true for the United States. It's true for the world. We had a huge turn down early. There's been a big bounce back now, but it leaves us only about halfway back to where we were and back on the path where we want to be. I will urge you not to be misled by the huge number for third quarter GDP growth that's going to be announced on Thursday of this week. That announcement is going to say that the economy grew by 30 to 35% in the third quarter, which is true. I'm sure President Trump will hype it to the moon, but it only is a bounce back from the very deep trough we got into earlier this year. And so it does mean we're only about halfway back. For the year as a whole, the economy will decline by 4 or 5%. Only China will show positive economic growth this year. Worldwide, 100 million people or so have been pushed into poverty and may stay there for a while. So point one to keep in mind is only halfway back. Better than we were, but not great yet. Second takeaway, I hope, health policy is really now economic policy and vice versa. Economic policy is mainly health policy. Getting back that other half and getting back on a progressive and sustainable growth path really is going to depend primarily on overcoming the pandemic. That obviously means treatments, vaccines, and the like, restore confidence in both consumers and investors. But more than anything that economic policy per se can do is going to be the importance of health policy. Likewise, if we got a new resurgence of the pandemic, the economy could turn down again. So the direction is unclear, even as we speak here today, with some of the numbers nationwide and worldwide looking once again on the worrisome side. That's a reminder that it is a global problem. We need a global response. On that count, my guess is that Vice President Biden would be much more active than President Trump has been. I think that would be a good thing to try to restore US participation in some of the global initiatives, because it is a global problem. And until the world economy as a whole gets back on reasonable track, the US is not going to make it too far alone by itself. Again, I must mention China. China has been the one country, maybe with Korea and Taiwan to some extent, which has recognized that you have to get your health policy right in order to restore your economic growth. As I'm sure you notice from daily news reports, whenever China spies even a minor new breakout of the coronavirus, they hit it with a nuclear weapon. They test everybody, millions in a couple of days. They did it in Kashgar over the weekend to stop any renewed spread. And that is a reflection of this reality. Health policy is really economic policy. The third takeaway I want to leave you with, maybe a bit controversial, is that in our upcoming elections a week from now, the Senate election may turn out to be as important as the presidential election in terms of economic policy, not on other things where there are vast differences between the candidates. But in terms of economic policy, the Senate election is going to be crucial. The economy is almost certainly going to need a new fiscal stimulus going forward, unless we have amazingly good luck on overcoming the pandemic in the next few months. But to get anything like a sustained growth pattern, almost certainly going to need a new expansionary thrust, maybe not quite as great as it was over the last 6 months, but at least of some significant magnitude. I suspect either president, either a re-elected President Trump or a newly elected President Biden, would want that, would want to start his new presidency, the new year, with a renewed stimulus package. But whether either of them can do it is going to depend on the Congress. And we've seen over these last 6 months that the Senate was able to block any new stimulus package. I must say that amazes me. I would have thought it was in their interest, political as well as economic, to promote a better prospect for the economy, but they turned it down. They could do it again. So whether the Senate remains Republican or changes control to the Democratic side will be a very big factor. Again, whoever is president, even if President Trump is reelected, he'd probably have much more success with a Democratic Senate than he had with his Republican Senate over the last 6 months. And that in turn could be critical as to whether we can get a new economic expansion program to get the economy going again. Fourth takeaway point, and to give the Senate Republicans their due, the ones who blocked the stimulus, but to give them their due, what's been happening by way of this huge recovery program to bring the economy back even halfway from the pandemic is going to leave some severe long-term costs for the economy. The budget deficit leaped to 15% of the economy, $3 trillion in the fiscal year just ended. That's way more, 5 times as much as the response to the global financial crisis, which we thought was a big deal 10 or 12 years ago. It's hugely more than anything that was tried to get out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. It's in the same ballpark as what was done with fiscal policy in World War II. Not that big, but it's by far the biggest fiscal response ever to an economic crisis, and therefore coming on top of a budget that was already in big deficit, a US debt profile that was already spiraling upward. It does sow the seeds for big problems down the road, particularly if it can't be reversed in the near future, which it probably can't. Now, in the short run, all this is fine because interest rates are so low. The Fed has kept short-term interest rates at or near zero now for over a decade. And that means the cost of servicing the debt is minimal. In fact, the real cost of servicing the debt is now negative. So you can get away with it for quite a while. That is, I think, necessary in light of the depth of the problem that we faced, but it also builds a long-term profile that may turn out to be unsustainable, surely will be at some point. And the big challenge, I might say, for economists as well as decision makers, is where that unsustainability point is and at what level we have to rein back in the expansion. Some people think 150% of GDP, we're now at 100 and going up fast. We just don't know that. But that's a takeaway to keep in mind, that problems have been sown for the future that are going to have to be dealt with. Okay, those are the 4 takeaways I want you to have in mind. Let me spend a little time painting the picture of where we have come, where we are, and what the elections might mean going forward. The pandemic actually produced a huge paradox for the US economy and US economic policy. It was, as I've already said, an historic shock to the economy itself. The drop in second quarter GDP up in the 30-35% range was the fastest in history. April was the biggest downside month in the history of the American economy. In other words, we were hit right between the eyes and very hard. But, and here's the paradox, the downturn produced the largest positive shock to the economy ever through the policy response, the fiscal response plus the Federal Reserve's further expansion of monetary policy. The fiscal stimulus alone equaled 12% of the economy. In 2010, after the global financial crisis, we had a 3% stimulus, this time 4 times as much, pushing the budget deficit up to what I said. And that big fiscal stimulus, the $1,200 paycheck mailings, the huge increase in unemployment insurance, the Paycheck Protection Program, all that together increased the disposable personal income of the American public by a record amount of 12% in the second quarter alone. So you had this juxtaposition of a huge downturn of demand, a huge increase in disposable income, which then the latter set the stage for this sharp recovery in the third quarter, where consumer demand picked up again, particularly of lower and middle income people, where investment began to pick up again, and where this big bounce back in the third quarter, to be announced 48 hours from now, took place. So that's the paradox, but then the outcome. Most of that fiscal stimulus stopped in July. All those special programs, the $1,200 checks, the expansion of unemployment insurance, all that stopped in July. And you have to remember here a technical economics fact. When a budget deficit declines, even though it's still a big deficit, that is contractionary for the economy. So if the budget deficit drops from $3 trillion to $2 trillion, which sounds like still a lot of stimulus, it takes $1 trillion off the economy and amounts to a contractionary negative impact. And so if you don't keep the stimulus going, you wind up back in the hole again, unless something comes along to offset that. So even with this big growth in the third quarter, we're going to go back in the fourth quarter on current policies and current prospects to some growth, we think, but still very low, 2-3%. And that's where the situation will be when we enter 2021. Back to low growth, but with a very high degree of uncertainty as to what the picture may be. So where are we? As I say, we've recovered about halfway. That's true for the US and the world. Big negative growth in 2020. On current policies, some resumption of positive growth in 2021, but nothing too dramatic, except for China, which could be up 6 to 8%. The US probably 3 to 4 on current policies, Europe somewhere in between. Hopefully, we would recover to the pre-COVID level of the economy by the end of 2021. That would mean 2 years of lost growth. Well, that wouldn't be too bad given to where we could go or could have gone, absent the big policy response. But it would mean 2 years of lost growth. However, if we don't renew stimulus, get some new injections of expansion into the economy, could go the other way and could leave us in the lurch once again with a second wave of downturn. So the outcome will depend on 3 key variables. The first one, as I've already said, will be the response to the pandemic itself. The timing of the onset of vaccines, remedies. We hope all that comes. We don't know yet. If it does, it'll be the most important thing for the economy as well as the public health situation. Without that, there's not going to be any strong recovery in the economy. There could be a new downturn. I would hazard the guess that a President Biden would take more energetic action to deal with the pandemic than a re-elected President Trump will. Now, there's a big debate, of course, as to whether shutting down parts of the economy works in terms of the economy. I think the evidence is that it does, that without definitively bringing the health situation under control, you don't get a sustained economic recovery. I think the Chinese case that I described earlier, which was emulated to some extent in both South Korea and Taiwan, demonstrates that. We may get a test of it early next year, depending who's in the White House and what public health policies are adopted. But my guess is on that one, President Biden would do a better job. Now, neither president, whoever is elected, is going to be decisive, of course, in dealing with the public health situation. That's going to depend on the course of the virus itself, how quickly the science comes along in terms of producing the vaccines and the remedies to deal with the problem. No president can dictate the outcome on that front. And that will be, I think, the most serious and the most overriding outcome in terms of restoring the kind of economy we would all like to see after the downturn. However, economic policy, of course, has a role. As a second key variable, I would point to the Federal Reserve and central banks as a whole. They have been huge. As I mentioned, you've had something like $8 trillion of monetary expansion over the last several years. The Federal Reserve has built its balance sheet up to $5 trillion. That means it's put that much money into the economy. It's keeping interest rates at zero, virtually zero, and therefore trying to stimulate both consumer demand and private investment as much as it can. A few central banks around the world have actually gone negative with their interest rates. Switzerland leads the league, minus 0.75%. The Federal Reserve has said it doesn't want to do that. It could do it. It does have other tools available if a new round of monetary expansion is needed. But that, as in most prior cases over the last decade or so, will be crucial. Whether monetary policy, which can respond much more quickly than fiscal policy, tackles any new downturn, and whether it keeps monetary policy expansionary enough to underpin a recovery of the economy as a whole. The Fed's positions won't be directly affected by the election, of course, but there'll be some indirect effects. The Fed's independence, I think, will be clearer under a Biden presidency. There's the matter of who the new Fed governors will be. There are still vacancies. The new chairman has to be appointed in 2 years or less. And so that too will, of course, reflect who's in the White House and who has the authority to set up Fed governance for the period going forward when all this will continue to unfold. But then the third key variable, and given the limitations on monetary policy in the Fed now, probably the big one is fiscal policy. That was the big stimulus along with the Fed back in the spring to respond to the initial coronavirus crisis. And that will probably, as I've said already, be called on in the new year, under the new administration, through the new Congress, to try to get things back on track. We probably need to resume a fiscal stimulus package along the lines of what was going earlier this year, but then stalled out in July. That was very ambitious, a couple of $100 billion per month in terms of fiscal stimulus. But to get the economy back on any kind of rapid growth path on a sustainable basis in the short to medium run, something like that is probably going to be necessary. And then that's where our elections become critical. As I said, either president is likely to want to do something along those lines. But whether the Congress is ready to go along is a huge question. Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats were clearly ready to go. They put a big further stimulus package out early in the summer, but the Senate would not operate on it. And the Senate, under the same governance that it has now, could block a renewed President Trump or a new President Biden. And so that's why I stressed earlier that the Senate outcome a week from today will in fact be critical. Now, as I also said, there's a big substantive problem out there because 4 or 5 of the G7 economies now have national debt levels that exceed 100% of their GDPs. The US and France are joining that club this year. But with interest rates very low, lower than growth rates, it means that real interest payments are actually negative and the debt can be financed. But the big question, and I think the big test for our new administration, will be how to reconcile the need in the short and medium run for continued stimulus with the need over the longer run to restore a sustainable fiscal position in terms of both annual deficits and cumulative debt for the economy as a whole. That will be the big challenge for whoever is in the White House, whoever is in the Congress. Let me then finally just tick off 3 or 4 areas of likely policy difference between the 2 presidential candidates. I've already mentioned several aspects of macroeconomic policy. Biden's probably ready to spend more than even Trump, but Trump seems ready to spend a lot if he could have gotten the Congress to go with him. Biden, of course, has big ambitions for tackling climate change. That means an additional big expenditure program on top of whatever's done for purely economic reasons. Those will have to be factored together in the national debt context. But that, of course, is one big difference in terms of the composition of government spending that would occur under a President Biden vis-a-vis a President Trump. A second difference will be trade policy. President Trump would presumably maintain more or less the trade wars that he has launched both against our allies to a lesser extent and to China to a bigger extent. Biden, I suspect, would eliminate the trade wars, the minor ones on steel and aluminum, against our allies, the Europeans, Canada, Japan, South Korea. I suspect Biden would wind those up fairly quickly. And I suspect he would limit but not eliminate the conflict with China. There are real trade problems with China. That's, I think, agreed on a bipartisan basis in this country and pretty much internationally around the world. There are differences in tactics. I think Biden would be less inclined to rely on retaliation, more inclined to try to restore the traditional U.S. multilateral coalition to work jointly against China, both through the international institutions, the rules of the game, and try to isolate China by putting together a multilateral grouping. The Chinese hate to be isolated. I think that approach would probably have a better chance. My guess is that President Biden would go down that path much more than President Trump has. Another area of difference, clearly telegraphed in the campaigns, is tax policy. President Biden would go for increased taxes on the very highest income groups. Probably most people would not feel any adverse effects from that, but he would try to pay for his other programs, including his climate change program, through significantly higher taxes on both high-income individuals and on corporations. So there would be some reversal of the Trump tax cuts under a President Biden, and that would be, I think, a main area of difference under the different regimes that are likely or possible to result after next Tuesday. So let me stop there. I've laid a number of thoughts, some perhaps controversial, on the table. And Jeff, I'll be delighted to answer any questions that you or others in the group may have.
Ryan, you want to take the questions? You're muted, bud.
Brian, I think you're muted.
I
There you go. Now I can hear you.
okay, I hit the video instead of the mute. Yeah, if anybody who is logged in has questions, there's a chat button at the bottom, and there's also a Q&A button. So if you have questions.
I'd like to start with one. Lee Forster with State Street this morning said that in agreement with your perspective that it doesn't really matter who wins as president. What's going to matter is who wins as Senate for a lot of the economic impacts. But his point was no matter who wins, the market will do better because there will be a stimulus and the dollar will weaken. His point was emerging markets would do better with a blue wave. Would you agree with that, that perspective? And then talk about maybe how some of the other investments that can support the economy getting out of the doldrums might help besides just pure stimulus.
Right. Well, I'm delighted I have such a distinguished company in making that particular forecast. That's good to know. I think that with the fiscal stimulus that could well occur with the right outcome in the elections, the markets would certainly be encouraged, and the stock market excellent performance over the last year would continue and probably get better. But it's a little tricky because I guess he and I both say, if you do not get a cooperative Senate, the stimulus might stall out, and you would then have the prospect of a turndown, really a double dip turndown, unless something really quickly and dramatic occurs to bring the coronavirus under control. Now, typically, the response to that would be easier monetary policy, which would also be good for the stock market. But as I said, interest rates have been at the zero lower bound for quite a while. The Fed could do more, but it'll be reluctant to go to negative interest rates. It can expand the balance sheet some, but that begins to get it into buying private equities, certainly corporate bonds, take steps that would affect the financial markets in ways that it would prefer not to do. So unless we can get a fiscal stimulus of some significant magnitude, or even better, get a definitive resolution of the pandemic, I'm not so sure how great the outcome would be for the market. The dollar, I think, as often happens, faces conflicting pressures in the exchange markets. If the US continues to come back better than the other major currency countries, mainly Europe and Japan, that implies a stronger dollar against them. China is the strongest economy coming back, most likely, as it has been so far. But they, of course, continue to manage their exchange rate pretty tightly. It's still basically pegged to the dollar. So they let it go up a little, but not a whole lot. So that doesn't mean a big decline of the dollar. So on those counts, the dollar might go up. Offsetting that would be easier monetary policy, but since there's not too much room to go, and since the Europeans have actually shown a willingness to go more into negative interest rate terrain, I'm not sure, but what that might push the dollar up. In a beauty contest, it's not necessarily who's the most beautiful, who's the least ugly, and the dollar might have that accolade. So I think the exchange rate stuff is pretty uncertain too. Emerging markets obviously benefit from lower interest rates, particularly in the US, and the extent they stay down at zero, I actually think emerging markets will continue to do pretty well. Asian emerging markets benefiting from the rapid growth in China, relatively rapid growth in China, I think will continue to outpace those in Latin America, rest of the world, and probably do reasonably well.
Can you bring some of this home to our port and what it means for us in a regional economy, in our regional economy?
The regional economy here, I think, has fared reasonably well given the national picture. And again, it goes back to the health situation. We were chatting before we went to public that Virginia's data so far in terms of the coronavirus are not great, but not bad. We're not seeing any big new upward spike, and that on the whole is a good thing, obviously for the economy as a whole. In terms of trade, where Virginia's got a big stake, that really depends on growth elsewhere. Europe looks pretty weak. Canada's, as usual, pretty much on pace with us. Latin America is weak. China, again, is a big driver. So trade, I think, net trade, exports, will continue to expand modestly, but nothing very dramatic. So say the outlook for the region is probably not too different from the outlook for the economy as a whole.
Fred, we have two questions from Dr. Bob McNabb, and I've asked Ann to unmute Bob. Bob, you want to ask your first question? There you go.
There we go. Okay. So One quick question is that we saw the GOP, when they held the Senate previously, pivot to austerity after an election where a Democratic president wins. Could we see that play out again and see an austerity shock somewhat similar to what happened in the European Union um, after the Great Recession? And second, are we overestimating the potential impacts of vaccines in the short run, given the rise of vaccine resistance in the United States?
Well, I think the answer to both your questions is yes. It's clear in retrospect that the turn to austerity in both the US and around the world after the global financial crisis was too quick and too much. And to go back to what I said in my opening remarks, you could characterize what's happened over these last 6 months as another austerity shock, because when you needed continued stimulus to maintain the kind of recovery we saw in the third quarter, but will not see beyond it because the stimulus ran out in the early summer, that's not quite an austerity shock in the sense of pushing us back into negative growth, but it certainly deterred continued positive growth. And unless we get a new stimulus soon, we could be back in the soup. So yes, I think your analogy is a good one. We could see it again. Now, this time, hopefully people will learn at least partly from last time and not replicate the error. Also, this crisis being caused by a pandemic, not even arguably due to bailouts of banks and profligate spending and excessive credit expansion and all that. The cause of the problem this time is a little more justifiable, one might say, in terms of wheeling out more ammunition to respond to it. So it doesn't necessarily follow that they'll make the same mistake, but they could. And that, as I was suggesting, but you put it more strongly, and that's fair enough, that could quite easily happen. Second question?
The second question was whether or not we are too hopeful about the initial impact of vaccines, given
Yes.
the rise of vaccine resistance in the United States.
Yes, I think that too, as I said, I think that's a fair point. Under the best of circumstances, the health experts that I listen to say that it's going to take most, if not all, of next year, 2021, to get the vaccine widely distributed throughout the country, even if everybody is eager to take it. And you add the additional variable, what if half the people don't take it? And we never get to herd immunity because we never have enough vaccinations. Again, one has to hope that there'll be enough education of the public, hopefully imploring from top leaders, local leaders, state leaders, as well as national leaders, to take a vaccine once it's demonstrably effective and safe, that number would go way up and we could get to herd immunity. But you're probably right, that will take some time too. And so from an economic standpoint, my guess is that it's going to be well into 2022 before we can expect any kind of decent, sustained economic growth to come through on a satisfactory basis that will eliminate the need, become self-sustaining, eliminate the need for special stimulus, and enable us to start dealing with the underlying problems. Keep in mind one fundamental about the US economy. The underlying growth of output potential for the US economy is under 2%. The Congressional Budget Office, in its latest projections, made a significant downward projection, significant downward revision in its projection for underlying long-term US growth potential. They'd had it close to 2, now they've dropped it to 1.6. That's a big change. That's a 20% change in terms of your outlook for long-term sustainable growth. And it means that even if we get back to some kind of pre-pandemic norm, growth is not going to be enormous. Now, in the meanwhile, we've lost at least 2 years, and you want to make that up. So you want to have faster growth in the intermediate period, at least 3 or 4% growth that would bring you back in a couple of years to your baseline growth path. But the long-term potential is only 2 or less. And so that's what we have to be shooting for to get back to as our long-term pattern. And both your points, and particularly the point about vaccine reluctance and delay in having even a successful response to the coronavirus, put the economy back on track, yeah, it's going to take a while. Remember that when we came out of the global financial crisis 10, 12 years ago, there was a huge debate as to whether we would have a V-shaped recovery or a much longer spread out U or even L-shaped recovery. It turned out that we had a fairly quick upturn after the global financial crisis, but it was very tepid. It was as we're continually reminded in the political arena, it was the slowest recovery that the US has had since the Second World War. The trade-off for that is it lasted a decade, in fact, until the pandemic hit. The economy had grown for 10 straight years, the longest recovery we had, but also the slowest recovery. So if you think that there have been some lasting costs from the pandemic in terms of lower productivity growth, need to reallocate resources away from declining sectors, of which there are many as a result of the pandemic, over to those which are positively affected, of which there are also quite a few. But those reallocations of resources take time. The decline in productivity growth that we've seen takes time. Restoring confidence to both investors and consumers clearly is going to take time. So if there's at least some rough analogy to what occurred after the last crisis a decade or 12 years ago, we're looking at 5 to 8, maybe even 10 years before we get back to our pre-crisis baseline and onto some sustainable path. Now, one hopes it's not that long this time, but one can't know, and it could happen. And so that's a very high degree of uncertainty and a lot of variables in the mix.
So is that a best case scenario or a worst case scenario? And I guess we could expound on that. What is your thoughts on the recovery? What's the best we can expect if everything fell into place? And on the worst case, what would we assume?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think the best case would be, and I tried to essentially lay that out in my remark, would be by the end of next year, by the end of 2021,
right,
we would basically be back to our underlying baseline growth of 2 without substantial additional stimulus from either the fiscal or monetary side that pushed the budget deficit and debt continually up to more sustainable levels. That might not even allow for much reduction in the budget debt and deficit, but at least it would not require additional positive stimulus. But I think by the end of next year, back to 2 to 3% growth, with unemployment back down to probably not all the way where it was before the pandemic, but say maybe to 5%, that I think would be the best case. The worst case would be if there is no early effective response to the pandemic and the government is unable or unwilling to put new stimulus in place, we could actually have a renewed turn down in the economy sometime next year.
yeah,
So I think those are the bookends,
yeah,
the outlier cases that are most likely.
yeah. Well, let's hope it's the former, not the latter.
Yeah, right.
Dean Tanner had a question, but apparently he's got a lot of background noise and has asked me to ask it. He wanted to know if inflation will be used to pay off the debt and what other options will be likely. Otherwise, it could take decades.
Well, I think most likely it will take decades. And remember, you don't really have to pay off the debt, but what you have to do is stabilize it at a level relative to the economy that can readily be rolled over and financed without strapping the country. The latter, as I stressed, is now easy because interest rates are so low. And debt service costs have actually gone down for the government, even as the debt and deficits have been skyrocketing. Now, that doesn't go on forever, but the Fed has said it's going to keep interest rates very low, close to zero, at least until 2023. It may have to do so longer. So that problem keeps getting kicked off down the road. But as I said, you can't kick it off forever. And at some point, it will have to be leveled off. But the key point is you don't have to actually pay off the debt, at least if you're the US financing in your own currency. You've got the world's currency. And I think the dollar remains there despite these problems we're having. So the question is where we need to level off to maintain confidence in our economy, in our government's finances, in the Federal Reserve, and probably at somewhere between 100 and 150% of GDP. But the truth is, nobody knows, and we won't know until the markets tell us after we get at least somewhat in that ballpark. I doubt that inflation will be the answer to it in the US. That, of course, would be a counsel of despair, and that would be even worse in a way than what we're talking about now. But I don't think it'll be necessary. Inflation, of course, has been totally absent for now well over a decade. Looks like remaining there, and unless economic policy and or globalization went totally off the rails, I don't think we really have to worry about inflation, or if you want to put it that way, hope for inflation as a way to erode the big debt and deficit problems we're in. But I don't think that's the likely course, either for the US or for the world more broadly, given the pressures of globalization, global competitiveness, and all the things that have brought inflation down, along obviously with the credibility of the central banks that have brought inflation down so dramatically over the last decade or two.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions from our audience? We have one from David.
Yes, I was in response to the pandemic. What about the flu epidemic of 1918? What were the economic effects of that, and what economic policies were used to deal with that, and how effective were they?
Hi to David, whom I know well. It's good to see you here. I'm glad for your question. I have a special interest in the pandemic of 1918 because my father's brother, for whom I was named, died in it while serving in the Army, getting ready to go to Europe for World War I. So I had a real interest in that. That pandemic actually had quite a large effect. The US economy suffered a recession in 1919. Part of that was the unwinding of the weather. There's a big dispute actually as to how much the pandemic affected it. Some analysts say the pandemic did not have much economic effect. The US had a recession in 1919. A lot of that was the winding down of the wartime demand. People feared that, of course, after World War II and took action to make sure it didn't happen, and it didn't, so that was good. But economic policy did not respond much after the pandemic of 1918. We had only begun to have a federal tax system in the United States. We had only created the Federal Reserve System just a few years before that. So we did not have either fiscal or monetary tools available to really deal with the economic effects of either the winding down of World War I or the pandemic. And so we were left to our own devices. There was a sharp recession. The economy bounced back pretty much on its own into the 1920s. And we know where that eventually led. So hopefully today we're in a lot better shape.
And we have a question from Maria. Ann, there you go. Maria, go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, Fred. Good to see you again, even virtually. I have a question about, I'd like to go back to China, if I may, and forgive me if you've mentioned it. I had to pull away during part of your comments, your opening remarks. So, but as you know, it looks like whether it's a Biden presidency or Trump, it seems that attitudes toward China from both parties have narrowed, and the differences have narrowed. It seems that polls are showing that the Democrats have hardened their attitudes toward China as well, with the exception that a Democratic presidency would probably turn to the allies, as you had mentioned also. So how do you see the future competitiveness in the economic environment moving with let's say a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency? Do you see much change, and how would an allied intervention change the dynamics of that?
Right. Hi, Maria. It's good to see you. Thanks for the question. I think a Biden presidency would change policy toward China in several ways. First of all, it would change the agenda. It would place a much bigger emphasis on human rights and values issues like the Uyghurs, like Hong Kong. I think that would play a much bigger role in their overall strategy toward China. They would continue, of course, with the pursuit of US economic interests, but they would add some other things. In terms of tactics, I already mentioned that, you mentioned it too, they would try to get away from the unilateral focus of the Trump approach, which in some sense isolated the United States, to try to multilateralize, get the traditional allies back on board, and try to isolate China on the strategic view that such an approach would be much more likely to succeed, which I think is probably right. It's important to remember that America's traditional allies, Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, a few others, essentially double our economic clout in the world. When you add up the economic size of our allies, it roughly equals our own size. And so when we work in concert with them, it roughly doubles our clout. And of course, in international institutions, votes, and all that. So I think there'd be a change in the agenda, a change in the tactics, and probably a change in the strategy as well. Trump, with his fixation on bilateral trade deficits, which actually makes very little sense in economic terms, has at the end of the day, in his trade negotiation with China, focused on selling more soybeans and semiconductors, and downplayed his own trade representative's focus, Bob Lighthizer focus, on trying to get structural changes in China's economic policy, its subsidies, its mandatory technology transfers, its theft of intellectual property. All that was cited in the cases that justified the retaliation. But in fact, the president's main focus was on trying to get more short-term sales of American products, even though that was unlikely to have any lasting net effect on our trade balance or our economy or our job situation. So I think a Biden administration would revert to the more traditional US approach in terms of objectives with China. It would change the tactics through which it did that, and it would broaden the agenda to human rights issues and such. The bottom line question from those three changes is whether you would then still be heading toward a new Cold War with China. I think they would try to downplay that rhetoric, would try to downplay that substance, but at the same time would be very cognizant that China is posing a fundamental challenge to the US, certainly in East Asia, increasingly in the world as a whole, increasingly in both economic and security terms. And so, as many pundits have said, this is probably the existential foreign policy challenge for the United States and its role in the world going forward. The Biden people will have a tough time, as the Trump people did, in trying to manage that, try to reconcile those different elements. My guess is the Biden people would have this broader view, what I would regard as a more promising approach, both strategically and tactically. But that is something which, you rightly say, is going to have to be at the top of their agenda, and one of the key variables, key uncertainties, not just for the next 4 years, but for the next 8, 10, 20 years going forward.
Fred, I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but I have perhaps a final question. One of the things that we're really tackling head on is the racial injustice, especially in the business community here in Hampton Roads. I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think the economic impact has been on with the racial injustice and the racial tensions that are going on in our nation right now.
Well, I applaud your tackling that, Brian. That's great that you're doing that. And I think it does relate directly to the economic outlook. It's a matter of psychology, confidence, a fundamental view as to whether our society is really grappling with the fundamental problems that affect large percentages of our population and ought to affect the totality of our population. It's become enmeshed with some more directly economic issues like income inequality. We know that the racial problems have worsened income inequality, and economists have now shown pretty conclusively that income inequality is not only a bad thing in a human sense, a humanitarian sense, but it's bad in terms of economic performance. It weakens the economy. It weakens the human capital that's available to provide a vibrant, buoyant, and long-term sustainable economy. So dealing with the racial prejudice, the racial inequality issues has very direct implications for our economic fortunes, as well as our social and political perspectives. And I'm delighted you're doing that. And I think it's an integral part of responding to this whole set of issues we're talking about today.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. We really appreciate it. Jeff, any final comments?